Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kara Griffith, the President and CEO of Tax Analysts. Thank you for joining us today as we welcome some very special guests. We have with us today 4 former IRS commissioners to discuss the future of the IRS and tax administration at a time when the Trump administration is greatly reducing the IRS's staff, its leadership is in flux, and private taxpayer information is being tapped in unprecedented ways. Given the broad scope of this topic, we're setting aside our usual 1-hour limit for our webinars, and today we will go up to 2 hours. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I thank the commissioners very much for being with us. Now, today's event is the latest installment of Taxing Issues, our series of public discussions on tax issues. We launched this series to encourage debate on the leading tax issues of our time, and we surely do have a lot to debate this year. We'll continue to bring the tax community together with leading policymakers and experts, provide partisan discussions on the future of tax policy and administration. As always, we welcome your feedback on how we can make our webinars more useful, as well as your suggestions on future webinar topics. You can send your feedback and suggestions to events@taxanalyst.org. For those of you who would like CPE credit today, please be sure to participate in the program for at least 50 minutes to receive 1 CPE credit and answer at least 3 of the poll questions that will appear throughout the webinar. They will appear on the right side of the viewing window above the comment section. To receive credit for your answers to the poll questions, you'll need to register with Pigeonhole, our interactive Q&A system, by providing your name and email. Also, please remain in the default viewing window because you won't be able to see the questions if you expand to full screen. The course materials, which were sent out in advance, are also available for downloading under the viewing window. Now, for a little background before I introduce the commissioners. Since January, the Trump administration, through its Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, and through the leadership of departments and agencies, has been reducing the size of the federal workforce. The IRS is not as cuts. In April, we learned that the administration was planning to cut the IRS workforce by between 30,000 and 40,000 positions, reducing it from a high of about 102,000 to roughly 60 to 70,000. That's a proposed cut of between 30 to 40% and will include reductions of those in taxpayer services and compliance. Significant progress has already been made toward that goal. Earlier this month, the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, known as TIGTA, reported that about 11% of IRS workers had left the organization, whether due to layoffs, deferred resignations, or early retirements. More specifically, 31% of revenue agents, that is, those who do audits, have left the agency, leaving questions as to who's going to audit the nation's largest taxpayers. 18% of revenue officers and 10% of tax examiners have also left the organization. In its IRS downsizing, the administration first targeted probationary employees and laid off about 7,300 of them. Many of them had been hired after the $80 billion funding increase for the IRS that the Biden administration pushed through under the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act. Those additional dollars in personnel were designed to strengthen tax enforcement, expand technology, and improve taxpayer service. The departure of more and more staff involved with audits and collections has also raised significant concerns about a revenue loss for the government, as taxpayers could become more aggressive in their tax avoiding strategies if there's less fear of getting caught. In March, House Democrats warned then-acting IRS Commissioner Melanie Krause that cutting audit and compliance staff could mean that, as they put it, wealthy tax dodgers will run free. The implications for federal revenue are not small. The Yale Budget Lab projected that a reduction of 18,000 IRS employees, far less than what the administration envisions, could generate a revenue loss of roughly $159 billion over 10 years. Nevertheless, the administration is standing by its cuts. A Treasury spokeswoman said that, and I quote, "The rollback of wasteful Biden-era hiring surges and consolidation of critical support functions are vital to improve both efficiency and quality of service," end quote. Meanwhile, the IRS leadership remains in turmoil. The agency is on its 5th acting commissioner since January. At the same time, the administration's use of taxpayer information is also raising concerns. The IRS agreed to provide the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, upon request, with information about people that ICE has ordered to leave the country or is investigating. And according to ProPublica, TIGTA is investigating whether the administration, OMB, or DOJ, tried to get private taxpayer data or other sensitive information from the IRS. So the question is, where do we go now? How can policymakers rebuild the IRS to ensure the integrity of our tax system, which, as we will discuss today, relies almost entirely on the trust and confidence of taxpayers to voluntarily pay their taxes? This is a weighty topic of immense importance. Now, the gentlemen we have with us today hardly need any introduction, but I will introduce them nonetheless in reverse order of their service at the IRS. So first, we have Danny Werfel, who is the 50th IRS Commissioner, was appointed by President Biden and served from March of 2023 until January of 2025. Next, we have Chuck Ruddy, who is Danny's predecessor and the 49th IRS Commissioner. He was appointed by President Trump and served from October 2018 until November of 2022. Way too many numbers in there. Next, we have John Koskinen, who was the IRS's 48th Commissioner. He was appointed by President Obama and served from December of 2013 until November of 2017. And last but certainly not least, we have Larry Gibbs, the IRS's 41st Commissioner, who was appointed by President Reagan and served from August of 1986 until March of 1989. I want to welcome you and thank you very much for being with us today. So let's jump right in. As I mentioned in my opening, the IRS is an agency that is in crisis at the moment. There's a lot of staff and leadership changes, but often with crisis, there is opportunity. And that is my sincere hope right now for the IRS and for tax administration generally. So Danny, if I could turn to you first and have you help us with a little bit of level setting, given how recently you left the IRS, I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on the state of the IRS as of January when you left, and also sort of talk about what you were able to accomplish while you were there, and maybe some things that you think would need improvement or that were left undone at the time at which you left.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Look, based on a lot of hard work from Chuck Rettig, there was funding in place when I arrived with a mission to do a couple of key things. One was to close the immediate performance issues and gaps that had occurred due to lack of funding, which was combined with the COVID pandemic, had really strained IRS operations in filing season 22, record low customer service, record low availability in our walk-in centers, record high paper backlogs, anemic audit rates at every level. We did not at that moment have a turnkey technology solution to fix it all, but we needed to serve taxpayers and serve the mission. So we went through a hiring surge, focused first on getting customer service reps to the phones and to the walk-in centers so that we could reverse negative trends in customer service. And then focused as well on both developing a vision for what modernization would achieve, and then working furiously to implement that vision. We were able to complete the hiring surge, as I think you referenced in your opening, and immediately turn around the customer service, getting it back to historic levels and in some cases historic highs, eliminated virtually all of the paper backlog, reopened and opened new walk-in centers around the country and exceeded historic high watermarks for the number of taxpayers seen in those walk-in centers. And then started to really make progress in accelerating the technology solutions on irs.gov, expanding the functionality of the individual taxpayer account, the business taxpayer account, creating more options for uploading documents, technology, and doing more and more digital. And our plan for modernizing, automating, and digitizing the IRS was laid out in our strategic operating plan, and very transparently, and it was both celebrated and criticized, as it should be. Celebrated for the important changes that would be made, sometimes criticized for that it was going to move too slowly. All criticisms that we certainly welcome. But the day that I left the IRS, January 20th, 2025, I'm proud of a couple of key things. Um, we built a resilient operation that enabled a successful filing season this past year. It was resilient enough to absorb many of the staff cuts, but I don't think it will be resilient enough to absorb it in perpetuity. We had more changes to the website for functionality for the taxpayer in the 2 years I was there than in the previous 20 combined, and that's because of funding. It's not rocket science, nothing special, other than having resources and bringing in some talented team to blend with the previous team or the existing team to unlock some of these successes. And importantly, I felt that morale was also increasing. We were demonstrating a focus on the employee that Chuck started, and I was all too glad to grab the baton on. Investing in individual career paths, training, respect for one another, respect for the taxpayer, of course. And while it was not perfect, when you have tens of thousands of employees, you're never going to achieve perfection. There was a real sense from the workforce, from the union leadership, and elsewhere that things in terms of the positioning of the workforce to succeed and to have a great career at the IRS was trending positively. Now, I don't think you asked me to weigh in on everything since then. I'll pause there. But when I left on the 20th, things were certainly not perfect. Things certainly had room for improvement. But we had a plan that was transparent. We were open to redirects on that plan based on public feedback, and we were making progress against that plan.
You know, you mentioned a couple of things, and I definitely want to jump into staffing next. But Chef, I want to come to you for a minute. And Danny talked about the morale of the staff at the IRS, and from an outsider looking in, I always thought that you did a very good job of promoting and championing the employees at the IRS. And so I just want to get your sense of kind of when you left the IRS, which wasn't actually all that long ago as well. As to where it was and what was the general consensus among those that were at the IRS.
Well, I think Danny hit it right on, which is not only a resilient operation, it's a resilient workforce. I think that internally, I would say that pretty much forever, the employees of the IRS were proud to be there. There's numerous challenges, and there's challenges within the challenges, et cetera, et cetera. And internally, people know that they meet those challenges head on really successfully. It's externals that take things and create narratives around the employees, the federal workforce, et cetera, et cetera. But, to give one example, I was commissioner when COVID hit, and we shut down the Internal Revenue Service. When we reopened, I think it was the Ogden workforce, we were 50% socially distanced, et cetera, et cetera. 70% of the employees showed up and said, put me in, and we're like, no, you didn't even get notice to come in. No, I want to work. I want to come in. I want to carry forward the mission, if you will. And that's always stayed with me, if you will, the pride in the workforce, the pride in the individuals. Hey, Danny talked about the collegial nature of the employees. If you got out in the field and you got around them, and I know we all spent as much time as we possibly could, if you will, in the front lines, you really felt. I think that IRS employees within the federal workforce, I'm biased, but I think that they're unique. And I think they understand the mission. The mission is to support this country. And, when you've got one avenue and we all join together in an op-ed, you've got one avenue that brings in about 96% of the gross revenue of the United States of America. That's the IRS workforce. You have to be proud to be with them and show them the pride of what we're accomplishing. So everything the country wants, I used to say, thank an IRS employee, right? You want aircraft, you want a bridge. The United States doesn't build that. They contract that. You want any of that? You go thank an IRS employee. IRS employees' fingerprints are on that, whether they happen to be the cashier in the cafeteria or the cyber expert somewhere else, or a frontline examiner or an executive. It's one agency, and the people there are important. We're going to get to, currency, but I think that's something that all of us are struggling with, the idea of saying, well, gee, it's that you can automate all of these processes. I think you'll hear all of us say, and then what, right? What are you going to do if you have another disaster? You have a COVID situation or a national situation. And I used to also say, when I would testify to members of Congress who seemed to want to come at the IRS, it should be noted that in those 3 rounds of economic impact payments during COVID, we sent our people home during COVID, March 27, 2020, is the CARES Act. IRS, we want you to get these payments out as rapidly as possible. We were paper-based. We flipped to a virtual operation. The IRS employees did 3 rounds, totaling 475 million payments. 3 rounds, March 2020, December 2020, March 2021. In record time, 475 million payments for economic impact payments, as well as individual refunds. The first round went out in 2 weeks. The second round went out in 48 hours. The third round went out in 24 hours. That's not because of technology. In part, obviously, it's a part of the technology, but we had the people who figured out the requirements and then the IT folks who made those requirements work. And just to close on that, TikTok came in and did reports. And the March 2020 launch, we got 98% accurate as to the amount. The March of 2021, we got 99% accurate as to the amount. We were half and just saying, when the statute said get these payments out as rapidly as possible, we were going to contact the Air Force and hire like a bunch of C-130s, fill them with cash and fly around the country. Because if you get into the mindset of people, the person living in a 1-bedroom apartment didn't want to go into the kitchen because they might catch COVID. We had to do all of that in that environment. And by the way, not to lose track, but March 2020 is also the filing season for 2020. So we were issuing refundable credits and all that. And Congress, for John, for Larry, for Danny, for me, for anybody who's ever been in that role, layers on responsibilities to the agency. Why do they do that? Because they know the people of the agency will be successful and will bring it home. And the comment I used to make routinely up on the Hill during COVID was, you asked us to do this. You didn't ask the VA or the SSA, who had the infrastructure in place to do, if you will, monthly or other similar types of payments. We trigger payments, which are refunds, off a tax return. So they came to us with a new scheme, if you will, and get these things out. And so that's why I come back and say, I'm not necessarily, I'm a huge fan of the IRS board, and we'll go through that. And, my true love for each and every one of them, whatever their role is inside the agency, are former employees. And I think all commissioners are going to tell you the same thing. We didn't do this. We got a lot of accolades for what a lot of people did that most people in the world don't even know our folks existed, right? So I think our relationship there, and, maybe take that into account of what we're talking about here, as we are biased, we saw our people perform. And I can't say it's strong enough. The IRS is going to be called on again to outperform every private sector and public sector organization. Something will happen. And it's that what if that the agency needed to be prepared for. And I think all of our, having been in those trenches, all of our thought processes are employees that are left, they'll rise to the occasion. And I had a lot of confidence. Will it be as good of a delivery as it could be? Time will tell. I don't think any of us will subscribe to that right now. So sorry for the rambling, but
No, it's
you touch there's 4 points. You're touching my rock. You touch my rock, you're going to get everything. And I had to be more proud of those folks.
Called upon to do tasks that are sort of outside of the scope of what their normal job is, and they do rise to the occasion. And so, it was with the ACAs. This isn't within the normal scope, and yet took it on and ran with it.
All right, just if I may, to help frame us for where we're headed, just from my term, 2018 to 22, we implemented 7 major tax acts, right? That's not a technology thing. It started with, we implemented TCJA, 7 major tax acts. You need people, thoughtful, careful people dedicated to the mission to work that through, and then obviously code the systems to the extent you can.
Yeah.
7 major tax acts from 18 to 22. And I think that every commissioner here can tell you they had this similar kind of a thing. And I know we're going to get to Larry. Larry's got some just precious stories about potential train wrecks and train wrecks. It's people that help solve the problems when the problems occur.
That's right. And at the end of the day, we will find that technology can assist us, but technology cannot replace the human in any respect. So, Larry, I do want to turn to you next and get into a little bit of nitty gritty first, although stories are always welcome as examples. But let's talk about the sort of the nitty gritty of an IRS and the personnel that you need, the type of personnel that you need. What does it look like? How many personnel, and sort of even by percentages, if you want to try to get that specific, does the IRS really need to continue to encourage compliance? Our goal is voluntary compliance. What does an IRS need to look like?
Kara, I'll be glad to chat about that. Taxpayer compliance really falls into, I would say, three categories from the standpoint of the IRS. Taxpayer audits to encourage compliance, taxpayer investigations to investigate those who have not tried to comply, and taxpayer collections to collect whatever money is owed by taxpayers that hasn't been paid at the time they paid their tax returns or filed the tax returns. The important thing I found in my first stint at the IRS, which was in the 1972 to 76, I came back 10 years later to become commissioner. But during the first stint, I learned that, generally speaking, the IRS was attempting to encourage voluntary compliance, realizing when the Income Tax Act was passed, it was not self-executing and would depend to a large extent on voluntary compliance by taxpayers. That's true today. It's been true throughout the period of time that we've had an income tax. People say, Larry, voluntary compliance. I don't voluntarily comply. I'm forced to comply. That's really not quite accurate. What the IRS has done with its staffing is to ensure that if money is owed, it would be collected. Also with the criminal investigators that are at the IRS. They're renowned. They're the only agency within the federal government that can follow the money. FBI can't do it. Other agencies have tried, but the IRS is the agency that can do it. Really, it comes down to audits. And what I was told was that the important thing in the audit area is for taxpayers to credibly believe that they could be audited. That's for recognition. There's not enough, there will never be and should not be enough employees for a one-on-one situation. Although my father was absolutely convinced that someone at the IRS every year looked at his return. He was surprised when I told him this wasn't true. That's really the key. And in terms of trying to indicate numbers, it's really an approach. So that in all of your audit categories, in the individual audits, you have low income up to high income. And the strata into which individuals are divided for purposes of allocating audit personnel are different. Your low income area is a very large segment of taxpayers, much larger than, for example, your high income segment. A lot of people think in terms of, well, why don't we go where the money is? Isn't that the way to allocate your audit personnel? And what I learned was, no, it's not. You want to allocate your personnel so that in your larger groups, there is enough in the way of audits that people credibly believe, hey, low income or not, I could be audited. And as you move up the scale, same thing. and realize that we're not talking just about individuals. We're talking about business taxpayers. We're talking about small, medium, large corporations, partnerships, trusts and estates. And then you get over into the exempt area where you have tax exempt organizations, charities, social clubs, things of that nature. You have pension, profit sharing, retirement plans that are tax exempt. You have tax exempt bonds. So the IRS has to allocate its audit personnel in such a way that in each of these categories across the board, there's a credible prospect that those that are in the group could be audited. Not easy. And particularly as the audit personnel has waxed and waned. And Danny mentioned that Chuck had been very, very successful in getting additional audit. And with the, I think it was the 2023-22 Act that provided $80 billion to the IRS over 10 years, over a 10-year period. Much of that was, not all of it, but much of it was allocated to restoring the audit levels. Because at the time that act was passed, the audit levels of the Internal Revenue Service were the same as they were in World War II. Hard to believe, but that's the level to which they had sunk. Nevertheless, as the levels go up and down, the idea is allocation of audit personnel to provide that credible threat. Has it been effective? We know from the tax gap studies that the IRS has done showing the difference between taxes owed and taxes paid. A portion of that indicates that the compliance level, non-compliance level has gone up over the years. That's something that we have to watch. That at least gives you an approach that is being used by the service. I can't give you specific numbers.
Well, that's all right. You probably would have been, it would have been a guess anyways. It was what I was going to guess. But the one point that I do think is interesting is, and I have often said is why are we doing so much auditing of low income? And I think that's a very good point that you made. So if you look at, it seems that the earned income tax credit is a disproportionately audited credit. And so is there...
Because the non-compliance is high in the earned income credit area. All right. Again, why start with low income taxpayers? Why not just exempt them? Because those low income taxpayers over time are going to go into the upper brackets. Once you have someone is not complying, they tend to continue that way. And so you're talking about people that over time, if you don't get them started in the right direction, if you don't get them complying, then you risk having larger and larger numbers throughout your system that are not compliant.
Also, under IRS, Treasury has to report improper payments every year. You have to touch a taxpayer base to determine and come up with data that says how many people are we paying who should not be paid. And so the improper payment rate, the numbers in EITC is around $60 or so billion a year in refunds, but about 20 billion of that is designated as an improper payment based on the audit activity, which is actually under 1%. When we were there, we were running 8 to 11% on the over 10 million AGI folks. And so you're required for IPERA to come up with data that says, what is the improper payment rate? But EITC is another one of my rocks. We kept pitching the family credit. Every person who has a child under 10 gets $5,000. Get us out of the qualified child business. And you have a statute that was created when Ozzie and Harriet lived together and had 2 children at home, and Ozzie worked and Harriet didn't. Not where you have multidisciplinary families. You've got grandparents, children living with grandparents supporting a child. The grandparent is making more than 50% financial commitment. The out parent believes they are, and the in parent believes that they are. So you run where maybe 3 people are claiming the EITC by statute. 1 person is entitled. And you need to look. These are very sympathetic group of individuals, but IRS should get that Congress should take IRS out of that business, just make it a family credit. I used to say when I testified, we've got $20 billion every year of improper payments. If you just did 5,000, you probably saved 10 billion, and the other 10 billion goes to people who maybe otherwise don't get it, but they're people with children. So you're, if you will, pursuing the purpose rather than having the IRS be criticized for its activities at that level. And it's really, again, it's one of the things, if you had the four of us together for an hour, for one of the issues that I think we would say people who don't understand unfairly criticize the agency and really thereby the workforce, this is one of the big ones.
Yeah, I would agree. And this is what, in just talking about who are we auditing, how has it gotten so complex that we're auditing certain groups, and why does it appear to be disproportionate to others? And this is somewhere sometimes the media gets out in front of the story and you're not getting the actual facts. John, I want to get your thoughts on sort of what we've said so far in terms of personnel, and maybe also talk about how do we right size? So we've talked now that we're losing a lot in audit. So how are we going to start right sizing the size of the IRS?
Well, I think all of us would agree after our tenure that there are things that you could do to make the place run better, and nobody has enough time to get it all done. So it's not as if the present situation is perfect. Chuck and Danny did great jobs, working through some of the problems and making progress. I think the challenge is that to make those improvements, you have to know exactly what you're doing. It's a complex system. Larry's talked at some length appropriately about the complexity of the audit process. The technology is complex. Getting with taxpayers is difficult. And so if you're going to do it, you run a great risk of not doing it very well if you just say arbitrarily, we're going to take 30% of the people out of here, whoever they are, and not worry too much about whether they're managers, leaders, or entry-level employees. So I think while I was there, because of the budget cuts, we went from 100,000 employees to 80,000 because the only way to deal with the lack of funding was just to not replace people. And so I was delighted to see the ability of the IRS to build back. 100,000 people is about what the agency had in 2020. And certainly even by 2010, they still had that number. So as the number of taxpayers was increasing by 10 to 15 million people, you had the IRS capacity and personnel available to deal with that shrinking. So it's not to say that there's a magic number, but I think all of us would agree if, as is going on, you take 30% of the employees out, as I say, sort of willy-nilly, it's not going to help. And I think that the result's going to be, Danny's talked at some length about the importance of taxpayer service, which is a big part of what the IRS does. Larry's talked about the audit function. When you lose personnel in both those areas, you're going to get less performance. And people will then complain about, well, the agency is not running well. But if you don't have enough people answering the phone service is going to get to be what I used to call, and my tenure got to be, as I warned people, abysmal. You couldn't get through, or you wait for half an hour and then get through, and then somebody didn't know the answer to your question. Then the same on the audit side. And you can talk about artificial intelligence, and to some extent, the IRS has been using artificial intelligence for years because algorithms are selecting. As Larry said, individuals aren't picking the returns. There are algorithms selecting where are the problems, what looks out of whack, where is it we ought to go talk to somebody. And so it's not as if the IRS has never done anything. It looks like automation. But the question is, no matter how sophisticated the artificial intelligence is, it simply produces for you questions. And somebody's got to go then pursue those, whether, as Larry said, either a call, a letter, an investigation, or a full-blown audit. Those are people. And I would just reinforce what Chuck said. I think we all found it's just an amazing workforce. When I was there, it was the lowest learner times, and everybody was complaining about the IRS and cutting its budget. And I did a series of town halls around the country and thought I would hear a lot of people complaining about, people yelling at them, talking about they're not hard workers, they're all brown baggers. And I was really delighted and surprised to find that each of those town halls, and I did a large number of them, the focus of the employees was how we're going to get the work done when we got fewer people. And I once got criticized at a congressional hearing, several congressional hearings, At one point, I said, at some point you can do more with less. And then there comes a point at which you do less with less. And one of the congressmen attacked me, what kind of leadership is that? How can you say that? And I said, because it's important for the employees to know that we understand that if you cut the number of employees by 20%, if the person to your left, and even the person to your left and right disappear, we understand you can't do the work of 3 people. You may try hard as you will and to do more, but employees have to understand that we understood that there just weren't enough people to get the work done. So I am concerned, not that the final number isn't going to be right, although I don't think getting rid of 40% is the right number, but whatever the number is, I'm concerned about the way we're going forward. There were reports that 20,000 employees accepted the buyout, delayed till the filing season was over. And as I told people, those 20,000 people are going to include managers, senior executives, people who have been around a long time, and they're not fungible. You can't decide later, well, we cut too many IT people, we cut too many revenue agents, we'll just go hire some more. Some of those people had 20, 30 years of experience, were experts in how the IT ran, how the audit process ran. And to find replacements for them is not easy. And usually what you do is you bring very bright, good people in, and you take 2 or 3 years to train them as you go forward. So I think we're in the middle of a certain amount of chaos, but I am confident, as all of us are, that the remaining employers are going to do the best they can. But my concern is, for a lot of people, the only interaction they have with the federal government is when they file their taxes. And to the extent that because of the constraints and the loss of people, the IRS begins to function inefficiently or more inefficiently, and people start to complain about the IRS, they're really going to be complaining about the government. And that ignores the fact that there's an inconsistency and irony in saying, on the one hand, you're worried about the deficit, and on the other hand, you're happy to constrain the ability of your revenue collection arm to do its job. And that obviously doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's nothing I can see in what's being done that's going to actually influence and improve the efficiency of the IRS. I think our risk, if you lose 30 or 40,000 people, the risk is the efficiency is going to go down.
I think that's true. Go ahead, Shaq.
Kara, on what John said, you need to find a balance between an oversupply of people initially with technology, and then you see how the technology sets in. You leverage the human resources you have, and the ones you have, you can reskill and move to another area. And we all can talk forever about the difficulty in recruiting, onboarding in any economy, let alone now go forward. But John made a comment, and it struck something with me, which was, the IRS has no friends other than the people internally, right? We went into COVID, we had 15,000 customer service representatives answering the phone, 15,000. And we were answering 40 and 41 million phone calls in 2019 and 2020. 2018, 2019. 2020, we got 281 million phone calls. And we asked for money. It's all appropriated. We need more people on the phones. And we can't take somebody from over here and put them over here. We asked Congress, we need more money to expand our phone service. We're trying to get 5,000 more people. And we had a shot at, in 2020, 281 million phone calls. In 2022, 282 million phone calls. So if you take the cutbacks now, staffing cutbacks, and we run into another COVID or similar, you can't all of a sudden just get on the horse and be able to perform the mission in the middle of a crisis. So it's the federal government. It serves the people of the greatest country on earth, the wealthiest country on earth, and our people and our services provided by our government should not be strictly resource driven, but there's a balance. And I think where we are seeing a lot of concern, have people focused on what's the right balance between the human resources, if you will, inside IRS and other agencies with technology. Ultimately, yes, technology helps you leverage the people you have, but being prepared for a what if scenario, we lived that what if scenario. And I think we're all consistently saying the people factor of the people inside the agency allowed the IRS to do as well as it could. And I'll just close on this point and say, what we saw on those 3 rounds of economic impact payments, by the way, it wasn't just $1,200. If you're breathing, you get $1,200. It was phased in. You had to be eligible. A ton of check marks. Plus, we developed close relationships with 12,000 charitable organizations and 18,000 public school districts to be able to get our information out, if you will, 400 homeless shelters so that we could get our information out to distribute that. But it wasn't just $1,200. What happened during COVID was those direct deposits and those checks showed the people of our country, your government knows, your government cares, and we're aware, right? You weren't going to make your next 5 car payments on $1,200 or rent payments, but it was an emotional component that I think is possibly as important as the dollar component if we run into something like that again. And we are the best country. We should be prepared for situations like that.
We absolutely should. And I think some of what in the last few months has been so concerning is kind of the haphazard nature with which we're doing all of the cuts across the board. And it isn't a logical saying, well, we could go down, 10% here because we're going to put in this technology. I think we have several years before we're going to get to something that feels, again, organized and well-staffed and well-run. Let's jump.
All right. Those probationary employees that Danny was able to bring in with the funding, they were the technical experts to fill the gaps where we had technical gaps. These were critical people. It wasn't just, we have 3 seats, let's go fill these seats. There was a lot of thought process that he put into who are the people, what are their backgrounds, what are their technical abilities. And I'll just throw it out there. I mean, both Larry and I have spent our world as tax lawyers. IRS in the examination front in partnerships, complex partnerships, the IRS has always been outgunned. Danny got, if you will, the folks on board who with a little seasoning, but a lot of these were mid-career people who said, hey, I'm going to go. I want to be part of this. And you go in a room with Larry and I and 5 of our contemporaries and 5 people who spent 50 years in the partnership tax trenches. And on the other side of the table is an IRS person. Now, without those technical people, IRS going to be outgunned. They're not even going to be able to spot the issues, let alone develop them and move forward. And I don't say that lightly. I think it should be, pretty much equivalent talent on both sides of the table. If you have to, you let the court decide who's right, but not blowing them out of the water in the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, that's been an issue, and in partnerships in particular. Danny, let's come back to that first before we jump over to technology and talk about all of the probationary workers that you were able to hire that were among the first that got laid off. It's a frustrating bit because there was thought and time and effort that went into hire them. Was that the right set of employees to focus on? And what now? How does the IRS replace the talent? And can they?
Definitely wasn't the right set because it was the expeditious set. Because the reality is that in your first year of employment, it's easier to separate you from the federal government. You don't have to go through the RIF process, which takes longer. And, we should mention that I don't know that it's been confirmed, but there is some evidence that the IRS is moving towards additional layoffs through RIFs and working through that process. For all the reasons mentioned, if you're going to downsize, it should be done strategically. And what we pitched when I was still there prior to January 20th, and we had an opportunity to brief the transition team at the time. And it was clear from them, not just behind the scenes, but public statements that were being made either during the campaign or during the transition, that they had an ambition to shrink the size of government as it pertains to the number of people. So we went into those briefings thinking, how can we provide these new leaders with a roadmap for how to meet that objective? And what we suggested was a strategic approach where you create a moonshot, if you will, of a staff reduction that could be, kind of significant so that you're kind of matching what you promised during the campaign, what you're promising publicly. But the roadmap to get there involves deploying the technology that would be appropriate to replace the individuals, proving that technology could be tested, deployed, and meet the mission needs, whether it's the taxpayer need on customer service or whether it is audit fidelity on the audit side or data security, whatever the need is. And so it's a step function. You automate or modernize successfully, you downsize. Next stage, next mile marker. You automate the next mile marker successfully, and then you downsize. And if you do that right, it would be a mix of new, mid, and later career employees. You'd also give these employees a heads up that your functionality is moving towards an automated solution. So you allow them to plan versus for a lot, I think for just about every probationary employee, an email at 10 a.m. and being told they need to vacate the premises at 11 a.m. And what concerns me about that not only is not how I would run the railroad, so to speak, in terms of how I would move forward, but also how do you convince a generation of talent to come to government, to come to the IRS? Because whether you are a staunch believer in small government or big government, but let's say you're a staunch believer in small government, you want the government to work and you want it to work effectively. You don't want to be frustrated by mistakes, by delays, and by incompetence. So if you're going to shrink the government by 50%, make sure the 50% that are there are talented, trained, have the tools, etc. How do you bring in the talent when the message you've sent to public servants is that this is more of an unstable job platform, that it could be that you'll get an email and have to vacate within an hour. And I think there'll be some post-trauma to these layoffs, not just at the IRS, but broader, that it'll be harder for someone like me, who's a fierce advocate for public service and public servants, to go into a high school auditorium or a community college or a college and say, consider public service as your career. It's a harder mountain to climb now to convince people to come to government. Again, not to bloat government, not to kind of fill the ranks with unnecessary employees. It's like, you tell me what size government you want, you still need talented people.
That's right. Without a doubt. And I sort of wonder that I do feel like we've overplayed what technology can do and how quickly it can do it. And so I wonder your thoughts on the IT staff that's at the IRS right now. Is it, you're going to need a lot of IT support. Is the IT support at the IRS right now able to develop and implement some of the automation strategies that we're suggesting will be the solutions here to people? I'm interested in your thoughts on that. I would suggest that that's probably not true. And then I wonder if we've just turned more of the impact over to government contractors who are ultimately going to be the ones that have to fill the gap. But Danny, I'm just interested in yours and then the group's response to what do we do about technology at the IRS and how much automation is reasonable to think that the IRS could implement?
Yeah, I'll get it started, and I'd love to hear from the others. I mentioned that when I joined the IRS, I was not aware of a turnkey technology solution. What I mean is, like, you can just bring it in and it can be quickly put up and running, tested, and perform with adequate performance levels versus the people that are currently staffing these operations. If that's available, I will be the first one to cheer. If it's feasible, I will be the first one to say they should absolutely move forward with it. And if I look back on my tenure, I think that there are some valid, and probably all of us could say valid, points where we could have broken more glass to move the modernization more quickly. And so I never want to approach this by saying, like, that there's just no kernel of valid frustration that the new Trump administration, the DOJ, have found in evaluating where the IRS is from a technology standpoint. My point is that if you have a set of solutions that you can bring on quickly and effectively and re-engineer technology to be more agile, you should absolutely pursue that. And again, I would applaud that. Here's my questions right now that I have at where we are today. What is that vision? We laid out a vision and a timeline and I'm sure you could throw tomatoes at that if you wanted to. What is the current administration's vision and timeline for modernization? What will be automated? What will be modernized? What will relieve the need for all these employees while still serving the taxpayers right down to every last bill of right that the taxpayer has a right to in law that the IRS is required to meet? Spell out that vision so we can see what it is. What are the progress points along that vision? When can this particular functionality be automated and this functionality be powered by generative AI or whatever the solution is? I'd like to know what the testing plan is to understand, like, are you going to test it for data security, fidelity, cyber, mistakes, accuracy, and customer service output before you deploy? And to your point, is it going to be run by contractors and outsourced? And if so, what's your contract management plan to make sure you're getting a good price point from the contractors and good support, and that the contractors are meeting all these fundamental responsibilities of being a good fiduciary of our tax system? So right now, more questions than answers. I don't want to basically say what they're suggesting is impossible, because I don't know that it's impossible. I just feel like if we're going to get behind it and cheer it rather than be concerned about it, there's a lot of open questions to confront to get to that point.
All right, Kara, I have some real fundamental problems. Let me tell you the biggest one I've got. Private industry. You make a decision that you're going to change things. And the first question you ask is, what's all of this going to cost and how are we going to pay for it? Let's go to the federal government. What do? They pass an act, the big, beautiful plan. Wow, what's it going to cost? Nobody's talking about cost. Yeah, we got estimates of what it's going to cost. But here's the key. Nobody's asking how much it's going to cost the IRS to implement the great, big, beautiful plan. We don't do that. We wait, and a year later, we start talking about, okay, let's go through the appropriations process. And that has nothing to do with what's happened in the last year and how much it's going to cost. This is crazy. But the point is that our government is not set up. Even with $37 trillion that we owe, it's not set up to address the cost issue. And when you start telling me, are you telling me technology is not going to cost anything? Is that what you're saying? I don't believe so. My point is, even if you come up with a great plan and everybody says, fabulous plan, will the IRS be able to implement it? Will they be given the appropriation at the appropriate point, particularly after the way the organization has been politicized by the politicians? Is the IRS going to get the money to implement the great plan? I'm skeptical.
Well, one thing you have to understand that I think sometimes the genius is coming in, is this is the famous fixing the plane while you're flying it. The IRS is going to get ready. IT people normally by June are starting to prepare for the next filing season. Some of this, you have to change all the forms. If nothing changes, as Chuck said, the minute you get a new tax law, and there are a lot of tax changes in the bill going through Congress, you then have to prepare for those and implement them as you go along. So there's a lot of work just making the system work without making any changes in it. And it has to be taken into account that it takes from now to January to make sure that the system is going to run efficiently and effectively and not generate its own mistakes. Interestingly enough, in the present budget, goes to Larry's point about the episodic nature of all this, they've zeroed out that, again, they did that once to me, the IRS modernization budget just ran it to zero. So one of the great things about the $80 billion in the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't $80 billion. Maybe that would have been a little more than you might have asked for. The key to it was multi-year. So Larry's point, you could actually plan and have a contract that said over the next 2 to 3 years, this is what we're going to get accomplished here. And you'd know what it cost, and you could, in fact, measure it as you went. The problem with the annual appropriation process is that you have to wait to see what you've got for this year. In other words, you got a contract and modernization, and it's the budget zeroes it out, and so much for your contract. And it gets more complicated when, as now, and in fact, for many years, you don't know what the annual budget is because you have continuing resolutions, and you're in October, you're in December. Now you're in May, but we were in February when the first indication what the budget was going to be, and you only had 6 months left to spend it. So,
John, even more than that, what we found is doing it the right way in terms of the 10-year term, and then you can use the appropriation process to claw all of that back. So if you do it the right way, the politicians step in and find a way to destroy what you've done when you did it the right way. And Danny, let me tell you something, folks. Danny did an incredible job in terms of laying out. In December, I watched the audience give him a standing ovation. When was the last time you heard a commissioner get a standing ovation when he laid out his plan for what was going to be done before the craziness started that we're now experiencing?
Yeah, John, you hit it right on. I think every single time I testified, every time I was in the one-on-ones, we asked for it. It got to be one word: timely, consistent, multi-year funding. And it's just, in my head, it just strung across. And if there's a pause in the room, timely, consistent, multi-year funding. And, looking back, so a lot of folks up on me. One, I'm an equal opportunity abuser up as to Congress. They need to support the IRS and quit attacking the IRS for their own political gain. The IRS needs to step into that and let the public know what the IRS does. Funding is critical. And so when we got the $80 billion, then everybody was focusing on the annual funding and saying, well, we'll just start pulling it back over here. And then I remember one hearing where Senator Wyden said, well, Commissioner, you said if you get this money, you'll be able to recover $700 billion. And I put my hand up. We didn't know Danny was going to be a follower, but whoever was going to be a follower, I didn't want to have to eat this project. And I said, no, actually, the IRS has never given anybody a number. We will be a better agency, better able to accomplish our mission, improve taxpayer service, improve enforcement. But you have never heard me or anyone in the IRS say $700 billion. That was a treasury figure that we didn't want, as it turned out, Danny to get hung with. Well, gee, we got you this money. How does that relate? And then I think what people need to understand, the way that money was scored, right? So $46 billion for enforcement. Everybody said, can't we move some of that to taxpayer service and modernization, right? I think our gross revenue was $4.9 trillion fiscal 22. Enforcement revenue was under $100 billion. Voluntary compliance is education, guidance, simple language, forms. We did a big push to get into other languages. It showed respect. It took the pressure off our phones, took the pressure off our mail, helping people try to get it right. The taxpayer assistance centers, you can retail, go to a local place, sit down with somebody who speaks the language that you're most comfortable talking. They can log in and fix your problem now. There's a whole system how this ties together to make it better, but it requires money to do that. On the tax, we didn't have enough money to put people in all those taxpayer assistance centers. So our people rode a circuit. Tuesday you're here, Wednesday you're here, Thursday you're here. That's not the prime scenario when you're the front-facing government. But that first thing that happened, they dropped $20 billion they repurposed it out of the $46 billion on enforcement. And then they just recently dropped another 20. That first 20 was traded, and we're administrators. So we're not public policy guys and the rest. We'll do what we're told to do. But that first 20 was traded for the child tax credit as a higher priority in order to get the votes. Let's take 20 of enforcement money. I I think conspiracy theorists could say the IRS was never going to get $46 billion of multi-year funding, that it was allowed to score $700 billion, which was the scoring from the Congressional Budget Office. Go ahead now, you can give away $700 billion, and in another year, we'll take back this $46 billion. Someday, somebody is going to write some stories on this stuff. And I think, the American people will be rightfully so surprised at the way all that works. If I tell you, I'm going to give you all this enforcement money, and now I can go spend to pay for, and then I pull away the enforcement money, something's wrong, right? I mean,
Yeah, without a doubt. So the question I'm going to pose this to the whole group is, how does the IRS repair its relationship with the politicians in Washington? Because a lot of this does come down to political toying with the agency, and the agency is one that everyone seems to love to hate. John, I'll start with you since you're right in the middle of my screen here. But how does the IRS repair that relationship to have something that is more productive in the future?
Well, the problem goes back to Roman times where the tax collector famously was not loved, and it continues. And there's a duality the IRS deals with. Larry talked appropriate length about how the audit functions work to try to drive compliance. What I tried to spend some time explaining to the Congress, but also to the public, is how much time and effort, and you've heard a lot of discussion here, particularly with Chuck and Danny, how much of the IRS time and effort is spent on taxpayer service, customer service, trying to make it possible for people to be compliant. I used to say that if you're trying to be compliant, the IRS is out there to help you. We'll try to answer your questions. There are installment plans, there are offers in compromise. We'll do whatever we can to help you get compliance. And then I'd say, on the other hand, if you're pushing the envelope or really trying to cheat, I'm happy to chase you to the end of the earth to make sure that you're not a role model for others. And it's that duality that has, as Larry says, you want people to worry that if they don't pay what they owe, somebody's going to show up knocking on their door saying, pay up or else. And so you need that for compliance. But on the other hand, you don't want people afraid of the agency. You want people comfortable that if they call on the phone, they're going to be treated well. Somebody's going to know the answer. If they visit a taxpayer assistance center, they're going to get the help they need. And so somehow I used to try to tell the congressman when our customer service really got to be awful. I mean, we answered about 8% of the calls. And I said, it goes to Chuck's part. It's not a political operation. And I could say tax policy is the domain of the Congress and the White House and the Treasury Department. Tax administration is what the commissioner and the IRS do. And there are only two political appointees, the commissioner and the chief counsel. And so it was important, it seemed to me, for people to understand that the agency really was there to help them, and notwithstanding the fact that everybody would like to stay away from the IRS as we go forward. So I told Congressman, I said, when you make taxpayer service disappear, in effect, it's not just Democrats who pay taxes or independents or just Republicans, it's everybody. So it's all of the people who are inconvenienced, the people who decide they don't like the government because they can't get through to the IRS, are your constituents. And you would think that people would not want to make life more difficult for their constituents, which all of the underfunding and all of these attacks make true. So I think we just have to continue to remind people that the IRS is there doing its best to help you be compliant. I used to tell employees, I understand when you are asked where you work, you say, I work for the government. And then people say, where in the government do you work? And then you say, well, I work in the Treasury Department. And then somebody says, where in the Treasury Department do you work? And then you say, well, I kind of work in the IRS. And I said, what we need is for you to be out there confidently talking about working for the IRS because people know you and they know you're a good person. They know you from church or from the soccer sidelines or the PTA. And if they say, well, gee, Bill or Mary or Sam are really good people, and if they work for the IRS, it can't be the worst place in the world to work. So I said, you don't have to wear an IRS cap or T-shirt to the Giant when you go shopping at the grocery store. But it is important for, we need 80,000 at that point, IRS ambassadors. People say, I work for the IRS, I work for the government. I'm proud of the job we do. We try to help you. You only hear from us negative if you're trying to cheat. But if you're trying to help, be compliant, my colleagues and I are there to help you. And I think we need to continue to have that kind of groundswell of people understanding who are these great people who work for the IRS and what are they doing for us.
Kara, I am. I was at the IRS as commissioner when I had full support from the Congress. Let me tell you how I got it. I don't recommend this, but I offer it as a precautionary tale. I came in 1986 after the disastrous 1985 filing season, in which the IRS could not and did not pay refunds on a timely basis. It affected every constituent of every politician in the federal and in the state governments. Okay? And the situation got so bad. In 1986, we passed the 1986 Tax Reform Act, biggest tax reform act since 1938 or 54. But when I went down on the Hill, I heard one thing. Your job, Mr. Gibbs, has nothing to do with the 86 Act. It's up to you to see that it never happens again. If you want to make the point to the politicians as to why to support the IRS, keep on trucking, guys. And if you run into another 1985 filing season next year, you'll be surprised at how they'll fall all over themselves to try to help the IRS for a while, because it'll affect them and their constituents directly. I don't recommend it, but I offer it as a cautionary tale.
I do worry that's the direction that we're going. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, in the dim, dark days of 2014 and 15, I should have thought of that because everything else was not working.
Well, it is really challenging, and I do worry that we're sort of going down that path again, that we've got an IRS that we've taken funds away from, we've taken a bunch of staff away from, and we don't have a plan for how we're going to improve taxpayer service or improve, and things will go downhill. Like, we're going to see a downhill before we see some level of improvement. And so I do worry that that's the direction that we're going.
Kara, if you go back to the Roth hearings in 1997, they had people testifying behind screens and, oh my God, IRS, accountants with guns. It was all kinds of parade of horribles. And then you had the 98 Tax Act, which brought in the 10 or 12 deadly sins. IRS employees essentially could be terminated for doing their job. And then look at all the statistics up till 2001, 2002. Essentially, statistics went to ground. It was not a highlight for the tax professional community. That brought on 33, what IRS identified as listed transactions, son of boss, and the rest. And I recently reminded a group of chief tax officers. I said, you're going to be pitched. People are going to say IRS is hunkered down. It's on its back. You're going to be pitched with a very aggressive tax planning. And I said, let me just remind you one thing. The largest criminal tax case in the history of the United States did not involve a single taxpayer. Southern District of New York, Judge Kaplan, 23 tax lawyers and accountants who had pitched these products at a point in time where it was believed that IRS was incapable of locating them. And I said, today, you're going to see that activity come up again. And I said, talking to the choir, you're not the people that are going to drink that particular Kool-Aid, but know that the technology out of the IRS today will catch up faster than they did in 2002 and 2003, and it's different. John used the word IRS ambassadors. That was my pitch for every employee. There was a hiring freeze from 2011 to 18. I got on board in 18. So we didn't have a recruitment office. We didn't have. So my thing to the employees was, if you want somebody in that carol next to you, help us go hire that person. And so you're an IRS ambassador. When you go to your neighbor's house, I want you to tell your neighbor you're proud to work at the IRS. And I'm going to give you some touch points, right? We took down in December of 18, I think it was, the largest child exploitation site in the history of the world. 337 arrests, 38 countries, rescued 23 actively exploited children. That was IRS CI Cybercrimes Project as the lead agency. They took down financing sites in the dark web for Hamas, Al Qaeda, and ISIS when I was on board. More recently, they identified and took down the largest international fentanyl network that's by the Sinaloa cartel. These are IRS people. So I used to go out and say, that's you. You're part of that team, right? Tell people. The employees in the Memphis Service Center during COVID wore IRS T-shirts to give to the South Bank Food Bank, right, in 2020. And they set a record, and they broke that record in 2021 as wearing T-shirts as IRS employees going, hey, look at us. Now, that same group of employees in January of 19, when there was the 35-day lapse, had actually been in line at that food bank to receive food. So our people are the people in the community. They're the neighbors, as John said, church and this and that. We're you. That's what I used to say. Where are you? And by the way, we're hiring. We always were trying to get, at that time, I said, we can take 4 generations. I can take everybody and it can be a family business. But I want to just close and make a comment that people who disparage the IRS fail to comprehend that the expenses of operating the United States of America don't disappear if the IRS suffers. What happens is you transfer the obligation to compliant taxpayers. And so a disabled, underfunded IRS significantly benefits unidentified, non-compliant taxpayers at the direct expense of those who comply. So compliant taxpayers should be in the stands cheering, yes, IRS, do your job. Provide guidance, provide education in a language that we can understand. I pride myself. I'm a public school kid. I'm a single syllable guy. I'm in awe when I'm around people who speak multiple languages. My wife's from Vietnam. I hear her flip into Vietnamese with her family. I struggle with multi-syllable words, right? But those are the people that we're around. And so we need to serve them where they are in the manner that's most convenient to them to help the ones who want to comply. And then John said it, I think, very clearly. Go after aggressively the people who consider a tax return an offer to negotiate with the government. It's not. It is our duty as proud Americans to support this country. And IRS is at that crossroads.
So how are we going to, at this moment, I suppose we're waiting to see where the dust settles on the number of ultimate layoffs that we have, but how do you continue to attract qualified, talented people to come to the IRS? We've long known, and Jack, it was either you or Danny that brought up partnerships. That's long been an area where it seems like the IRS has been outgunned in terms of knowledge and sophistication of the argument coming in. How do we continue to attract the right people who want to do public service? It's going to be a very challenging. I know we've lost several tax analyst people to the IRS, and it's always I don't know. It's one of those where someone comes and says, unfortunately, I'm leaving, and I've decided to go and work for the IRS, and we always applaud it. It's great. So we've given them some level of knowledge in tax law and how to write, and now they go serve their country. It's one of those that I shake a hand and say whatever I can do in the future to help, I would love to do. How do we keep that momentum up in the current space that we're in?
So everybody knows I'm an extremely proud military dad. My son is a major in the United States Army. He has deployed 3 times. He may be coming up on another deployment. He wears the flag on his shoulder. And what communications, Terry Lemons used to tell people, Commissioner followed his son into government service. I was super proud about that, right? For decades, out on the tour or whatever, I would encourage people, you want to go to work for IRS? This is the highest order. You want to help support the government that supports you. Right now, we all pitch this. Great experience, job security, great working environment, training. By the way, on the comment about the people with 30 years who are leaving the government, I think most people should be aware. Those are the people that train the newer folks, the less experienced folks who come on board. So when you take away the trainers, how are you going to train going forward? But then the ultimate is, I think, what draws a lot of people, respect for actually, in our way, serving the country. today, and I know the other commissioners are doing the same, I'm providing support for those people who have recently left the government or who are in the government and have one eye on the door because they don't know job security. These are people with families, financial obligations, et cetera, et cetera. We don't want them to struggle. So instead of being, if you will, a pitch man for the IRS, I'm available to help people transition, hopefully voluntarily, into the private sector. I don't know what you would tell somebody. Come on board the IRS.
Wait a minute, guys. Whole question. Are we saying that we think it's difficult, if not impossible, to hire people to the IRS? That has not been my experience. It hasn't been my experience over a period of years. Our problem is, how do we keep them? How do we keep the politicians from reducing the budget so you have to worry about not being able to replace people that are leaving? But it's not that you can't hire on the front end. At least that was my experience.
So John had a hiring freeze for his entire term, and then continuing resolutions. And continuing resolutions, you don't know your budget until March-ish. And so from October to March, for every 4 people that leave, you can only hire 1, assuming you have the ability to onboard 1 recruit to onboard those people. Go ahead, John. Tell them how well y'all did on the recruitments. It was tough.
So, first of all, for Larry, I try not to exaggerate, sort of known as just being a steady guy because I've spent my life doing turnaround private sector in the government. And so getting overly excited doesn't help. I think this is the biggest challenge to the country since the Civil War. Nobody has seen anything that looks like this. Nobody has seen people coming in and saying, I think what we'll do in a short period of time is get rid of 40% of the employees. And nobody has seen a government that means public service. I mean, when you have the head of OMB saying people should be traumatized, they should worry when they come to work, not exactly a selling point. Nonetheless, I do think that there's a residual core of a lot of people out there. My experience when the IRS was in the middle of being yelled at, and as Chuck said, with not any ability to hire much, we had a window of opportunity one year, and we could hire 500 people. And I wondered, because we had no connection anymore with universities, public policy schools, how we were going to do. And I was amazed at the number of people who said, yeah, I'd like to come work for the IRS. And because it would be challenging, it would be public service. As I've always said, having spent 20 years of my career in the private sector, the great thing about the public sector is when you get up and go to work on a Monday morning, you don't have to ask whether it's worthwhile. You know, wherever you are, that what you're doing is affecting and helping people. And so it's a worthwhile cause. In the private sector, if you make more widgets, that's important. But, nobody's really too excited about the widgets. But everybody's excited about the ability of government at all levels to provide services to the public, to protect the public, to provide it the information it needs. So I think we have a good selling point, but it's the first time we're selling against that kind of push from the government, demonstrating that, you're not valued if you work for the government. We'll be happy to send you a notice at 11 o'clock in the morning that you got to clean out your desk. I mean, the pictures at AID and all across the government of employees with bags and cartons or stuff they're taking out because they've been told to vacate the premises before the day is out is not helpful. So it is going to be an interesting challenge to see about hiring. But right now, the challenge isn't hiring. The challenge is trying to adjust to everybody who's leaving. And my concern is we talk about technology and what's the status technology partner when the chief information officer and the deputy chief information officer have left. And I don't know how many people underneath them in IT have left. Those are all, again, the people who knew intimately how the complicated systems work. And replacing them is going to be tough because no matter how good you think the ultimate system is going to be and easy to run, you got to get from here to there. And you need.
Look, I agree with what you said. I agree with. We'll see what happens, but I think if the IRS were permitted to hire entry-level people, not experienced people necessarily, but entry-level people, the challenge is going to be take what you have left and fill key positions of the knowledge that is leaving the agency. I agree with that. But entry-level people, I may be wrong, but I don't think you're going to have that much of a problem.
Well, I hope you're right, because it's important for the government. But the point you make is one that, again, people in Doge and others are ignoring is I think entry-level people is where you're going to be with a lot of this. And it takes 2 to 3 years at least to get those people up to speed.
No doubt about it.
No doubt about it.
Larry, in our lifetime, there's no entry-level partnership person who's going to be able to sit across the table from you and I. Never going to happen. So the technical areas where IRS is hugely deficient, you cannot rely on what today would be entry-level people or less than 5 years. And so just take what we know, right? Partnership tax, and multiply that times. I'm sure there's a similar thing in IT, similar thing in HR. It blends through the agency. Really complex.
Well, all I can say is my friends that basically went into the IRS to begin their careers think there's no better place to go. They don't think the law firm, but particularly guys, you don't realize what's going on in the law. The alternative for folks coming out of law school, they can choose the private sector. I may be wrong, but I think in the tax area, you're not going to have that much trouble filling entry-level jobs.
Right. And the challenge will be who's training them, how many people you have to take, experienced people to train them. And when a lot of those people are gone and you're trying to run with a skeleton crew, I think you're right. I hope you're right that we'll get entry-level people excited about public servants. But there's going to be a gap. And the challenge is going to be what happens in this next filing season. And whatever happens, if it doesn't go well, the first response by people is going to be, well, it's the agency. It's all those government employees. And I can guarantee you that whatever the problems are this next filing season, it won't be because of the employees. It'll be better than it would have been because of the employees. I think our experience across the board is, and I say I spent 20 years in the private sector, I'd never worked with a better workforce. I've never worked with people more dedicated. And as I've said, and I really mean it, and I continue to say it, the best thing about my 4 fun-filled years of 40 years was dealing with the workforce. It was just a
my big concern for next year is frankly taxpayer service. Filing season, yes, but particularly taxpayer service. The reason is because people worry about the complexity of the tax law. Change is every bit as bad as complexity. And you're going to change a lot of the tax law with this big, beautiful bill. And that means you're going to have to train the folks on the telephone. That means the demand levels are going to be huge when you get toward the filing season next year if this act passes. I think to me, that's where the risk is from the standpoint of the IRS next year, not compliance.
I think that's right. There's a huge amount of taxpayer service that either won't be done. I'm decidedly worried it'll be done by technology. And I don't think we're in any way ready for that. And we're going to have an expectation that AI can do things that it is not yet ready to do. And then what happens when taxpayers are given the wrong answer, which is honestly worse than no answer, in my opinion, which I wanted to pick your brains about was what is going to be the taxpayer's comfort level with new technology, with AI? Could we see an AI chat bot? I would let my bias in and say, I hope we don't, because that really worries me. I appreciate all of the new technologies that are coming out, and it can make research, the beginning levels of research, it can make it very easy, but you do have to become sophisticated with how you're asking an AI tool a question, and then how you're drilling down to get a better answer. But I'm interested, Danny, maybe I'll start with you on how much technology do you think taxpayers are going to be comfortable with and should be comfortable with?
Well, that's why I mentioned earlier the importance of testing. Look, we've been on a journey at the IRS to better understand what taxpayers favor and can be okay with from an automated standpoint. Let me give you an example. At some point, we started pivoting taxpayers on the phones to if they wanted to create an installment agreement for a balance due, to do it through pressing buttons versus talking to a customer service rep. And then at the end, we survey them. How was your experience, right? And we aim to hit, kind of a benchmark, a government-wide benchmark of customer satisfaction north of 70%. And if you can achieve that, then you start learning these are the parts of the tax services portfolio that will lend themselves to directing to technology, to a bot, to an automated solution versus other things that don't work so well. And then the technology catches up, right? Well, when we tested that 2 years ago with the version 1, we got low customer service points, but now they're up to version 3. Let's try it again. So and this is no different than what your bank does or your retailer does if you're going shopping in a department store online, whatever it is. They are rolling out solutions to test whether their customers will be okay with the more automated based solution versus needing an actual person. And as you know, based on living your life, a lot more today versus 5 years ago versus 10 years ago is done with AI and with automation, and there's been success. But that didn't happen overnight. And that didn't happen with testing. And this is what's important. It happened with customer centricity, right? You want to make sure that the customer is dictating the pace of how we're changing our interface with the customer, because we don't want to screw that up and lose customers to our competitors who maybe have thought more strategically and more nuanced about this. So I am very bullish that a fair amount of what taxpayers are doing today with humans or in a manual process can be shifted. And the question is, what is the plan? What does that look like? And how are we going to put in guardrails to make sure that if we're using AI, some of the guardrails should be, are we building trust with our customers? Are we doing adequate to superior levels of performance? But the other thing, and I'll pause after this, is with respect to AI, when I was commissioner, I got a lot of tough questions around, pushing from both sides of the aisle to be thoughtful about AI, because AI can, if it's not well articulated and well managed and regulated, could it surveil a taxpayer? Could it overreach on a taxpayer? Could it unleash a bigger version, a 1984 version of government, unless you're super transparent and super careful about what you're doing? And so I always approached AI cautiously because the stakeholders wanted me to be cautious about it. So I would invite those same stakeholders to be cautious again, because if the answer is AI is going to replace the IRS, then you have to, or the IRS workers, then you have to raise these questions again.
I think that's well thought out. And the one concern I've always had with AI and the IRS is if you've got an AI tool, you're going to have to input data into the tool so that it starts to learn and it can produce answers. What is that data set that we're going to be putting into an AI, a generative AI tool at the IRS? And I worry decidedly that that there could be too much data that goes in, and then we're going to get into taxpayer information. And what of the taxpayer information goes into an AI tool that becomes that training set on which it learns? And so there are necessarily, I think, a lot of guardrails that need to go around how an agency like the IRS implements and uses some of these tools that are going forward. Which frees me.
This is one more point. This is why sometimes things take longer, right? It's not that if you come into the IRS and you say, currently 20 people have access to this data, we'd like 25 people to have access. The answer isn't no. The answer is, why do the additional 5 people need access? And then can we reset our control environment to make sure that when we add 5 more people, these 5 people know the rules? They're not going to port taxpayer data into their personal laptops. They're not going to leave those laptops on the metro train. They're not going to, we validated for insider threats and other things. Like, so as you expand or narrow either the number of people or the number of systems that this data exists in, you want to make sure that you're doing it thoughtfully so that you're not increasing security risk, cyber risk, unauthorized access, insider threat, all the things. This is risk management and IT security 101. It is really not rocket science, but it does tend to slow the process down. So if you walk into a government agency on day one and you just got your badge, it's fresh, it's still warm, it was just printed, and you're like, give me all the data. Or move the data to my friend who's working and it's his first day or her first day at this other agency. The answer isn't automatically over my dead body. You want to go through a series of questions. First of all, do we have the legal authority to do it? And then if we do, what is the need for that information? And if there is a need, what are the corresponding security controls that we're going to put in place to make sure that when we share the data, we're doing it in a way without increasing the risk that China gets their hands on the data or some bad actor out there who wants to do something bad with the data. It just takes time. And this can frustrate taxpayers and frustrate new government leaders who've never been in government before. But this is the medicine we take in order to balance these various needs of security versus speed.
Yeah. You have to understand the IRS is a great target of opportunity for organized crime syndicates around the world. When I started, we were sending almost $6 billion a year to criminals all over the place. I used to always say criminals in Belarus. One day I was in a congressional office, introduced to a staffer who was from Belarus after I'd already said that. But she said, no, that's exactly right. They're all over the place in Belarus. Terry Mulholland, who was then the chief technology officer, CIO, one day told me early on that we were pinged 1 million times a day by bad actors trying to figure out how to get in the system. And I said, 1 million sounds like too big a number. I don't know if I can say that. And time went by, and about a year later, he said, now we're being pinged 4 million times a day. I said, now I can say 1 or 2 million, and I know I'm being conservative and cautious. You can't overestimate the interest of criminals in access to the data. The goal they had in those days was to file a false tax return before you did. Very thoughtful, never made it huge. It would be $3,000, $5,000, $10,000. But as soon as I can buy anybody's social security number for $10 or $15 on the dark web. So you should not assume that that'll ever happen to you. Get a taxpayer ID pin from the IRS to avoid that. So when people talk about all this, AI is wonderful and moving more things in and out. But Danny couldn't be more right. That people just don't understand what a target of opportunity the IRS is for criminals who are looking for ways to get access to the data, access to the systems, access to, in fact, the money.
And it's not just taxpayers. Remember that you've got return preparers that basically said to the low-income folks and others, come on in, I'll get you a bigger refund. Matter of fact, it'll be twice what you've got. And I'm going to take my fee, but you'll have a lot more money coming to you. And you had to deal with that too, John.
Yep.
It's, I want to say it's a brave new world, but it necessarily should take time. It's taking time everywhere. And so this isn't like this is limited to the government in terms of implementing an AI tool or implementing even automation tools. These take time, even at a small organization like I'm at. It takes time to get things. You have to test them. The last thing you can do is get the answer wrong, because then you really undercut the confidence of everyone. So it is one of those where I think Danny's 100% correct. I struggle with the, why we're expecting this to be done in the blink of an eye, when we shouldn't want that. We should want very careful controls being placed on the information that is contained at the IRS. So I love automation. I think that there's a lot that we can do, but I worry about it at the same time, particularly in an instance like this. So Larry, I did want to come to you to talk a little bit more about confidential taxpayer information and its importance right now, particularly given the additional pings that are being done to get information out of the IRS. So could you talk to us a little bit about 6103, confidential taxpayer information, and the need to protect it?
Here, I'd be glad to. A lot of this is history. And unfortunately, I've been through a lot of it myself. When remember that basically we supported our country, after the Civil War until 1913, with tariffs and excise taxes, and then our ancestors amended the Constitution. Now think about that. Amended the Constitution. That hadn't happened in our lifetimes, but they amended the Constitution to impose a graduated income tax on themselves. When in 1913, when that happened, folks started thinking about, again, what we've been discussing all along today. This really is a voluntary self-assessment system. It's not going to be a one-on-one, one IRS employee to one taxpayer. How do we get the taxpayers to comply with their obligation and to turn over to us their most confidential information about their finances? How do we do that? One of the things that they hit on, and this was very, very, very big during my first stint at the IRS in the 1970s, because of the attitude of Wilbur Mills and the head of the Joint Committee, was this concept under Section 6103 of the Code that taxpayer information, as broadly defined, very broadly defined, should be kept confidential and not exposed to anyone other than a very short list of individuals outside the IRS that needed the information. And so they came up with the idea that if an IRS employee, for example, disclosed confidential tax information, he or she could be prosecuted and would have to pay a civil fine. Basic IRS employees are risk averse. They shy away from anything that would give them that kind of risk. Other things have happened during the history. IRS employees were going into they weren't disclosing any information outside the IRS, but the IRS employees were going into the confidential files and browsing in those files, looking at income tax returns of people they weren't auditing or working on. And so the Congress passed, again, laws basically that heavily penalized that kind of activity. My first term was under President Nixon, when President Nixon he fired two IRS commissioners because they refused to audit the president's enemies. And of course, that's one of the reasons he resigned. It was one of the two counts in the draft Watergate indictment. And laws were passed back at that time, basically indicating that if someone outside the IRS in the administration, presidents, name positions, or attempted to cause the IRS to do something similar, to use information in their files to audit particular taxpayers, that again was very heavily penalized. And this concept is something that within the IRS, within the chief counsel's office, the attorney's office for the IRS, you have people that have spent their lives looking at and studying the very complex provisions in the regulations relating to Section 6103 and these other laws that I mentioned. And this came up most recently with an attempt by Homeland Security to get information from the IRS, as was mentioned earlier, about immigrants. We actually now have a court case that seems to authorize that. It's a trial court decision. I don't know whether an appeal has been filed, but it won't surprise me if an appeal is filed. There were indications that there were some in the Internal Revenue Service, in the Chief Counsel's office, that were very concerned about the interpretations that were being made in order to permit that to take place. Interestingly enough, as I understand it, the Secretary of the Treasury entered into an agreement to share the information with Homeland Security. I would think, from my experience anyway, that you would add that would be very, very closely looked at, not only by Chief Counsel and the IRS, but also the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Tax Policy. But in any event, the concern here is that permitting disclosure that goes beyond the bounds, or risk going beyond the bounds of Section 6103 in light of this history, is something that should be very of concern because of the potential implications it has with respect to people continuing to share confidential information with the Internal Revenue Service when they file their tax returns or when they otherwise deal with the Internal Revenue Service. That's basically the policy that underlies the provisions, and Carrie gives some background for why this has become an issue at the present time.
So I'm interested, Chuck, I'll come to you first on your thoughts on this. Preserving confidential taxpayer information has always been of the utmost importance. So I'm just sort of interested in your views, as well as of John and Danny, in your views on changing the restrictions regarding protecting confidential information. Oh, sorry, Chuck, you're muted.
You're muted, Chuck.
And that's my fault. We were told not to mute, but I had a cough, so I was apologize to everybody.
No worries.
I don't think that that we're looking at or should look at changes to this for every reason that Larry said. The best I can say is what Larry said, right? I mean, he said it really in detail, and you have to take things and put them in context. It looks to me that what occurred is folks lawyered the issue and tried to wind through things because there's terminology there about a criminal investigation. So a criminal investigation is an exclusion from 6103. So, you put enough lawyers in a room, I could probably take either side of this position and convince somebody. And Larry made the comment, a trial court was convinced. We'll see if the appeals court's convinced. And I'm a believer in the court system. I don't always agree with the outcome, but I definitely am a believer that we have the finest court system in the world. So I don't think that we are going to look at or should look at that. I do think that I know a lot of judges personally, and they understand the gatekeeper concept, right? In a particular case, they understand the importance of how that and their actions might be interpreted for numerous other matters. So it'll be interesting to see it play out. I would very much oppose opening up 6103 to anything else, because the bottom line is what you have is trust in the system. You have to provide personal financial information to the federal agency, and you do so with the idea that the agency is going to protect that information because of the nature of what it is. And Larry used the terminology quite a bit before about a voluntary compliance system. People who believe in the system and the guardrails for the system will be more likely to step in. Danny's got his hand up, and he's not on mute, so we'll go to Danny.
I just wanted to reflect on this point, Chuck, you were making, that there, that you could look at the provision in 6103 and lawyer it and maybe conclude. And I just want to reflect that there was a point in my IRS tenure over the summer where the entire council team came to brief me on the impact of the Supreme Court overturning Chevron with a new doctrine called Loper. And they said, what this means is that unless the statute is explicit, the Supreme Court is saying that the executive branch can no longer imply or impute authorities that are not explicit in the statute. So if we want to do something where the statute doesn't say it explicitly, we're going to have to go get Congress to give us that explicit authority. We can no longer, kind of assume things that Congress must have meant. And so when I look at this debate on whether the IRS has the legal authority to share data with DHS for the purposes of immigration enforcement, and I understand that nowhere in 6103 does it specifically delineate as such, I wonder, and I'm not the expert on this, I wonder how you square that with the new Loper doctrine.
Well, but Danny, you have to, I think unfortunately, what has gone on a lot is the media has taken a narrative and then backfilled where it is. Look at what the agreement turned out to be. It's limited for a criminal investigation. There is a specific exclusion in 6103 for a criminal investigation. You don't need Loper right if you have a criminal investigation. If it is a purely civil case, IRS does not have to give the information. So that's why I'm saying somebody went and looked at 6103 and then backed up off of that. It doesn't have to be immigration. It can be any agency. For a criminal investigation, 6103 gets opened up and we give the information. So you have to look at how they wordsmith, if you will, lawyer was the term I used, the agreement. And I think
that's a fair point. I do think we're seeing, this is, I think there's a broader point here that might be worth pointing out, is that people say, what do you make of what's going on at the IRS today? And my answer typically is, I don't know, because the winds haven't died down yet. In other words, it's almost like there's a hurricane working its way through, and it's still nighttime. And when dawn breaks and the winds have died down, we can figure things out. So like you're pointing out, when the winds die down, we might find that the DHS data sharing is way more narrow than we originally thought. Now, as of this taping of this webinar, there's media reports that the IRS is going to reinstate and hire, or at least offer the jobs back to probationary employees. What does that mean? Is that because they're following a court order, or does that mean that they have determined that they cut too deep to the bone on enforcement and now are recalibrating? So, and then, by the way, when they do try to hire back folks, how much success will they have? As Larry points out, under the Larry Gibbs theory, they should have good success with the new employees, but under the John Koskinen theory, not so much with the more seasoned employees, who probably, if they're talented and have good expertise, probably have landed new jobs and made safe only once before they come back again. But we don't know. And so on all of this, we're challenged with having to wait for some equilibrium to be achieved so we can kind of assess where we are. And so a lot of confusion reigns right now. And I don't envy, to be honest with you, as much as I love being the commissioner, I'm not sure I envy the new IRS commissioner who's going to come in a high period of uncertainty and have to try to stable the ship. It's going to be very challenging.
Once again, from when
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I would just say that my concern about this is fundamental to taxpayer compliance is taxpayers feeling comfortable that their data is going to be protected, both from criminal syndicates trying to break in and other people, employees or contractors, as they go. So I am concerned about anything that sends a signal that there are cases where, your information could be shared. I haven't read the details, although what I've seen in the agreement, it does reference, as Chuck says, criminal investigation. But I don't see anything that requires, the way it's going, that they actually show the IRS the criminal investigation underway. In other words, it seems to me the way the agreement is working, they can say so-and-so is under criminal investigation. And as Chuck said, we could all be under criminal investigation if somebody just wanted to say it. So I think you have to, again, going back to where we are, we have to be very careful One of the former Justice Department executives said when they wanted access to information, they had to get a court order demonstrating that there was a criminal investigation and they were going after people. And I think if they were doing that, I feel more comfortable than sort of a blanket. We've got these people under criminal investigation, whether they're under criminal investigation or not. And to its credit, the IRS, as Dana has said, takes this very seriously. I don't know about anybody else, but I was forced every year to look at the half-hour video explaining to me why 6103 was sacrosanct and the ways you could get in trouble inadvertently looking at your mother-in-law's or your father's tax returns just kind of for fun. And so
let me give, I've been kidded about vignettes. Let me give just one vignette in this area, and it kind of ties into a bunch of things that have been said in this conversation. Again, during my first stint at IRS, the Department of Justice was trying a case, was a reasonable compensation case. The question of whether a corporation that was paying its controlling shareholder a salary was a reasonable salary. And the government had relied upon in saying that it wasn't reasonable is that they went to this company's competitors and looked at what the competitors in the private sector, not a public corporation, were paying their executives. Very confidential information. The attorney for the taxpayer said, well, if that's what you're going to use, I'm entitled to see it in this court proceeding. And the Department of Justice said, no, you're not. And the judge said, oh, yes, they are. I got a call from the head of the tax division at the Department of Justice letting me know that they were going to turn over the confidential tax return information of the competitors to the attorney for the taxpayer. At the same time, I got a call from the then head of the Joint Committee, Larry Woodworth. And Larry said that he had understood that this was happening. I verified it. Larry talked to his boss, Wilbur Mills, and called the tax division head and told the tax division head, I've just been talking to the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. If you do this, and I understand you'll have to do it this afternoon, he has informed me that we will introduce legislation to take the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice away from the Department of Justice and give it to the chief counsel. The information was not given. That shows you just from the standpoint of within the government, how different people feel different ways about these kinds of issues and what self-help looks like when it's down and dirty.
I think Danny's right that we all have to wait to see what things look like when the dust settles and the sun shines. But I don't want to let this opportunity go by without expressing my broader concern. As Larry said, it's 7217, I've discovered, specifically says the president and nobody in the White House can actually instruct or suggest that there be an audit. And yet we now have the White House suggesting that Harvard ought to lose its tax exemption. That's what they deserve, and looking at tax exemptions for others. And together with this move toward sharing data about undocumented immigrants, it does seem to me that it's important as a policy matter, but it's going to affect the ability and willingness of taxpayers to give their data to the IRS and to have the IRS not be politicized. It's important for people to understand how significant it is for taxpayers to feel that unless there's some significant problem out there, their information is protected. I love Larry's story. And I just think the message needs to go out that at least from the standpoint of commissioners, we all understood that you would do whatever you could to protect taxpayer information. I got asked at a hearing why wasn't I willing to share information about undocumented immigrants who pay about $70 billion a year in taxes. And they do that because they actually, if they have a chance to become citizens, the first question they're asked is, have you paid your taxes? And I said, our job is to collect taxes and from whatever people owe. It's the job of other people to worry about immigration policy and the rest of it. And we're bound and determined to protect the information that taxpayers give us, unless there's a court order or there's a specific investigation going on. But generally, It's not our role to collect data and then share it with anybody else.
Well, I think that goes to the very core of voluntary compliance. The taxpayers have to feel comfortable that if they follow the rules and they pay their tax accordingly, then they go forward, and that the information that they're giving, which quite honestly is a lot, will be protected. They won't be targeted. All of this just goes right to the core of the system that we have of voluntary compliance. We've got about 5 minutes remaining, so I want to just sort of open the floor for a moment on when the dust settles and the sun is shining again. What is the hope that the IRS will look like? Chuck, I'll start with you just for a minute or so. What is the hope for what the IRS is going to look like at that moment? Or what is the hope that a plan will look like? Danny has referred to a plan a couple of times, and I would hope and assume that there is a plan being drafted. You can't function without one. But what are we hoping for in the end?
So remember, the IRS interacts with the most sophisticated and unsophisticated taxpayers on the planet, large corporate individuals, people who do not speak English, et cetera, et cetera. They deal with everybody. They deal with more, if you will, Americans than any other organization. So you've got to balance the enforcement as well as the taxpayer service guidance and the rest. And sort of my thumbnail sketch in the back of my mind was always, for me, the ideal IRS is a combination of Apple, ergonomic delivery of meaningful services to people to help them get through their lives. And then the tax equivalent of SEAL Team 6 for those who consider it a challenge and want to see how much power the government has and don't want to step in and comply with their filing and payment requirements. So I see it's a blended operation. I think the attitudes of the people who work there completely fill both of those. On the enforcement side, there are super sophisticated, smart, dedicated people. On the service side, same thing. So I look at it as a blend between, an Apple delivery for the folks who are trying to comply, and let the others know that if you think you're all that, we have the ability to bring it to you, and there's a price to pay.
Danny, what's your thought on this?
Look, I think there's a lot of data now on the strategic approaches for the IRS. And I think we should take what we learned from each of them. And, from the one that's going on right now, there's certainly some learnings that there may be a different way of doing business. There may be ways to move quicker, to break glass in a more substantial way than previous IRSs have. But from my vantage point, we need some controls on the glass breaking. So it's kind of like, I always have this vision of a scatter plot, and where do you draw the line in the scatter plot? And I think you could probably see places where the IRS was too risk averse, too slow, and not aggressive enough in moving towards modernization. And right now we're seeing the opposite. And so I hope that when the dust settles, and maybe we're seeing some of that with some of the calibration that the Secretary of Leadership seems to be doing to pull back some of the more aggressive DOGE actions, that we're moving more towards the middle of the graph. And hopefully that stabilization will allow a sense that you can start, that with calmer waters, you can start building that future. Right now, it feels very hard to imagine building a future when we're not sure where the next set of rifts are coming. We're not sure whether, because I mentioned the probationary employees, my understanding is the Trump administration is also appealing the court ruling to reinstate those probationary employees. So again, until we have a sense of what the preferred outcome is in terms of staff, we need to then hope that they build that's more moderated, but still ambitious.
I'll give you my 30-second pitch, which I used to always say the goal was not my goal. It wasn't to get the IRS ahead of everybody else. The goal was whether we could catch up. And my standard was, could we give taxpayers the ability to deal with the IRS the way they deal today with their financial institutions, their bank, other managers? You ought to be able to. Most people never talk to anybody at Bank of America or Wells Fargo. Basically, they deal electronically. They make payments, they make deposits, they make withdrawals. If they have a question, once in a while, the bank will say, did you actually write this check? But it's all done basically electronically, easily, and in a customer-friendly way. And my hope was that one of these days, the IRS would be that way and people would see it as totally responsive, easy to deal with. For those comfortable with technology, there will always be people who need to call because they don't know how and don't want to learn how to run a computer.
Larry, I want to give you the same 30 seconds.
I won't take it. I don't know where we'll come out of this. I really don't. So I'm going to express my hope. My hope is that one of these days we'll get the $80 billion and Danny Werfel's plan. And we could do that. That would be nirvana as far as I'm concerned.
I'll second that. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. This has been an absolute honor for me, and I hope that you all have enjoyed it and gained some information from these four gentlemen who have in their time seen a lot. Thanks again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in another episode. Have a great day.
Thank you for having us. Take care.
Thank you.